YOLO composing gloves here. And today we're going to be going over some mixing dangers of sub bass. So I'm going to tell you some things in here that, just to be aware of. I'm also going to tell you some things that are pretty unusual and strange to consider, but are not typically done. So the first thing is on your mixing danger list, a lot of sounds like the low end, don't add it if it's not needed. For example, piano likes to go down there. Piano has a great sound down there. Pretty much every sound, honestly, has some degree of low end, unless it's like a bell sound or something, because that's where we just associate when people say a sound is warm. Typically, it means there's not a lot of high frequencies, and they exist down there in that mid range to mid to low range. So be aware of that. So when you're mixing in your sub, take it into consideration. Is this taking away from other sounds that could fulfill the same role? So don't add it if it's not needed, which we've already sort of beaten to death in the previous tutorial. Make room. So consider panning in volume to all your sounds before EQ and other options. This is a consideration thing before you grab your equalizer, because a lot of people just grab these EQs and compressors and start going at it. Usually it's part of the creative process, but if you're just sitting down and mixing, always think, wow, what if I just pan this? What if I just change the volume? A lot of times that's all you need to do. Most people agree that like 80% of mixing is just volume and panning. And that last little 20% is the tricks with the compression, and you can get pretty extensive with those. But if your volume and panning is wrong, your mix is going to suck. So always consider that first, and don't try it, because if you do an EQ move and then change the volume, you're going to get completely different results depending on how big your EQ move was. So make room for your stuff. Don't let things don't make footsteps louder than the lead sound. It would make no sense. In a movie, if the footsteps were louder than the dialogue, people would be like, this movie sucks. So, all right, there we go. Check your ADSR. So that's your envelope. Now, we didn't talk about envelopes yet, but I included in here as a tip. Common thing people mess up is a lot of times if they got their volume right, but there's like an unusual click or something, they'll start jumping in and looking at all sorts of things. They'll EQ, they'll try compression, all these things, when a lot of the times if it's a synthesis sound, it's just your ADSR envelope. So your attack, decay, sustain, release. If your release is really low, you'll get a click. If your attack is really fast, you'll get a click. If your decay is really fast, you'll get some sort of a click. So check your ADSR envelope for things like that. If things aren't blending correctly, maybe the attack of one sound just needs to be smeared a little bit more. Suddenly the sounds will merge better. So check your ADSR. Okay, so this is the weird stuff. Normally forbidden techniques. So these are techniques that if you said this in a mixing form, people are going to attack you with, they're just going to get you. They're going to say, don't say that. That's forbidden. And it's taboo here, man. Didn't you read the description of our Reddit page or whatever? And so techniques, now these techniques are usually better in thinner tracks because in a big track, normally they're considered forbidden because they're always considering, like they have some idea of the music you're working with. Like an EDM track brings to your mind a certain level of complexity. So if you have a thinner than normal track, some of these techniques that are normally forbidden can be worked out, such as the deadly verb on the sub bass. You'll hear about this. This was actually kind of controversial, but verb on the sub bass. If you have room in your track for it, maybe you're doing that jazzy deep house type vibe, it could totally work. So give it a try, even though, and just know like, oh, this typically isn't done, but I want to see what comes out. You don't need to like follow this rigid book of rules. Just be aware of the issues you could be creating later on down the line. Verb on a sub bass spells disaster for a low end on your, from a mixing perspective. And then are you adding it to a sine wave sub or maybe a triangle with only the first couple harmonics? What are you adding it to? And delay-based effects as well. So you could test it out. Maybe you'll highlight it for a second and the rest of the track could go back to being normal. Don't rule out these sort of forbidden techniques. Consider sidechain versus ducking, creating a hole in the spectrum. So remember earlier I showed you, in fact, I think I still have the same project open. I said here I like the ducking more. So I'm not going to explain this. Maybe I'll link a tutorial I've done on this. But I said I prefer the fruity balance, the exact control over an actual volume knob, over the control using compression, because compression brings with it an envelope that may alter your dynamics in a way that you don't want altered. If it's a multi-band compressor, now you might bring one out specifically for that reason. So you want to consider the differences between sidechain and ducking. And in fact, I'll probably link a tutorial in here for those of you who are less versed in the world of mixing. Because what you're trying to do when you do this stuff is create a hole so that something comes through for a second and then the other thing comes in. So there, I have a kick drum and a sub bass, both love the low end. So I create a hole, and that way the kick hits and then my sub bass comes in. And ideally it'll work with my kick, and now I've created a new thing. They're no longer enemies, they're friends. One doesn't cover up the other. Okay. This one, yeah, this is all caps because I've seen people do this before, and it's just like, what the heck? That's what I think. I'm like, what the heck are you doing? So I've seen people adjust their sub bass, which is ideally just the first couple frequencies, with an equalizer. And that's what your fader's for. If your sub bass is that complicated, then okay, if it's that level of complexity. But I've seen people do this to sine waves. They pull open an EQ to dip a sine wave. And now if it's a compressor or something, okay, but even then you could just automate the volume. That goes to number one. I'm getting a little angry about this just thinking about it. So yeah, that's what your fader's for. If you are using a fader to adjust, if you're using an EQ on your sub, one of the only reasons you do this is if you're doing some sort of compression technique that you think is just a better workflow option, which I could see that. Or you're treating one of the deadly techniques you decided to use, even though they're typically forbidden, such as you're EQing the verb on your sub bass, which is cool. That's fine. I'm fine with that. Maybe you would bust that to a separate track anyways. But yeah, use the fader. Don't be adding EQs to turn down. If you're doing that, you don't need the stub, or you don't need it that loud. Like, it's just weird. Maybe now another permissible reason for using EQ is maybe there's one note that has an issue and you need to just turn down it. So if it's a sine wave, obviously a note you can equate to just a frequency. So you just go into EQ, duck the frequency, boom, custom volume chart for your sub bass. So that's okay too. Just don't be the guy who turns things down with an equalizer. Use the faders or one of the many other volume knobs inside FL. There's a volume knob here. Every synthesizer has volume knobs all over. There's one here. There's one here. There's one here. There's one here. There's one over here. Like, holy cow, man. Don't use an EQ, please. So anyways, if you didn't know, now you know. Sub bass is one of those things that suddenly eats headroom like a monster if you mix it at a bad monitoring level. So this one is, you might have a great mix at a particular volume level, but what if you're going to play it way louder than that or way softer than that? The perception of frequencies will change because of the Fletcher-Munson curves. So bass frequencies need to be turned up more to hear them. So if you're mixing really soft and you're turning up your bass so that it's loud enough, when you turn that mix up, your bass is going to eat the rest of your frequencies for breakfast. It'll sound like a very boomy mix. So you want to mix at an appropriate volume level. I have several videos on this. I'll probably even link a couple of them here as well. Because of that reason right there. So you want to ask yourself, what is my audience going to be listening over? Are they going to, ideally, they're not listening over phones. I mean, if they really like your music, they'll have some decent headphones, or in their car, maybe is a common one. So, maybe mix for that. If you plan to be played over a big system, mix to be played over a big system. Where suddenly your bass considerations, you're going to mix louder, and you need to turn up bass frequencies less, if at all. You don't really need to turn them up if you're listening loud enough. But that's kind of dangerous mixing that long. So that's like a whole other topic, but there are several tutorials. But just check your monitoring level. Make sure it's reasonable. The big thing is you just don't want to mix too soft, because that will really screw up your levels. And when you get to the mastering phase, you'll end up having way too much bass when you try to master it, if mastering is going to be a big portion of how you turn up your volume. Some people, and I personally do this quite a bit as well, is I will mix to my level. So I might mix for like -60 dB, but some tracks I'll go ahead, I'll try and mix to 0 dB. And you get a special kind of polish when you do that, but you don't often get the same dramatic loudness. So if I'm going for like a big EDM track, I'll follow other mixing conventions. So it's all genre specific. There's different workflows for different sounds. So that is pretty much the mixing dangers. Just be aware of these things. Try some of these things out. Just have fun with it. There's not really set rules for mixing, but there are generally good practices that will achieve results you want anyways. So consider these things. Next up, we're going to go over some exercises, which is going to be pretty great. Some of this stuff I'm still working on a little bit, but it's going to be really good. You'll get some more experience with your sub bass. You've seen all this stuff we've covered the sub bass. Surprisingly, we're still not done with sine waves. But we've covered just about everything I could think to really say about it. Like if anyone has a question about a sub bass that I have not answered, go ahead, give it a go. I'll answer it. I mean, unless it's a dumb, pointless question or one that I think you could find the answer out easily somewhere else. So anyways, yeah, it's a tonal technique. We have not done a Burgessian analysis on this yet. We haven't considered the 6 aspects of sound and so forth. We're going to do that with the sine wave. This is just like a little subsection of the sine wave that I feel like is a good spot to start learning about synthesis. And that is it. Watch some of these other videos of what other people have to say. If you have suggestions on things I should change or add, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day.